Hold your bulletin up, if you would please. Today's bulletin. Very good. On the back side is the outline of today's thoughts from the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, wisdom from Solomon. And just for my curiosity, at the end, I want to make sure I was thorough and complete. I'm going to see if you were able to fill in the blanks. Okay? It's not a test to see if you're listening, although that's what you're thinking. We'll see if my message is clear. I want to also point out that the last scripture reference, Proverbs 11:12, should be at the bottom of the first column. And the reason I tell you that is because if I were sitting where you're sitting, looking at this and listening to a preacher up here, I would be looking to the next scripture. I put them in order that we're going to be looking at. I would be looking in my Bible to the next scripture reference so that when he got there, I had my Bible open in that scripture. That's what I'd be doing. So I just point out that that one at the bottom of the second column should be at the bottom of the first column. That will help you, hopefully, as you anticipate the next scripture we're going to look at. Has anyone ever told you to hold your tongue? Hold your tongue. Ever hold your tongue? You know, that's hard to do. That's hard to do. I'm not talking about literally holding your tongue is hard to do. I'm talking about actually holding your tongue. That's hard to do. Now, the tongue is very slippery. And it's hard to hang on to. And I think there's a good lesson there for us. I want us to talk about the wisdom of Solomon today in a message I've entitled, Well, Shut My Mouth. A little expression that maybe is used more in the South than anywhere else. Shut my mouth. Hold your tongue is another way we might say it. Now we know that's just a figure of speech. It's not to be taken literally. How difficult it would be to understand one another if we actually did hold on to our tongue as we're trying to talk. It's a figurative expression. It simply means to stop talking. Don't say another word. Hold your tongue. We have other expressions. Bite your tongue. We'll talk about that in a minute too. That one actually hurts. It's not only, well, it's not so hard to do. We do it inadvertently. But when we do it, it hurts to bite our tongue. Or we talk about, my lips are sealed. All of these are idioms or expressions that we use to caution us about our speech. To be careful about what we say and how we say things. Shut my mouth. Stop talking. Well, Solomon has a few words to say about holding your tongue, and one indicator of wisdom is knowing when to keep your mouth shut. Our proverb for today is chapter 10, verse 19. When there are many words, trouble is likely to happen. But the one who holds his tongue is wise. Many years ago, I participated in a revival meeting in Keokuk, Iowa. I was the music evangelist of the week, and the preacher of the week came from a large congregation in suburban Indianapolis. That church has a school, elementary school, K through 12 actually. And every day they have chapel. And so one of the days during the week that they had chapel, the preacher for the week of the revival was the speaker for chapel. and I remember it to this day, he brought out 2 stacks of books and put them on the communion table right there in front of all the students and teachers. And his lesson that day was about the tongue, speech. And he said, a preacher who preaches on an average 50 Sundays a week, give the preacher a couple Sundays off for vacation, will speak the equivalent of, I think he said, 9 novels. That was back in the day when they had church on Sunday morning and Sunday night. Preaching twice on Sunday for 50 weeks. He calculated it. I don't have any idea how he did that. But the point was, a preacher talks a lot. And when you talk a lot, the writer of Proverbs says, trouble is likely to happen. His point was, when a preacher speaks that many words, he's going to make some verbal errors. He's going to say some things that may be ill-advised, that if he had the opportunity to take them back, he would. He's going to say some things that are wrong, and the same thing is true for all of us. The more we talk, the greater the opportunity for trouble, right? And so the advice of Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon is, well, shut your mouth. Shut my mouth. Because when there are many words, trouble is likely to happen. And the one who holds his tongue is wise. We're talking today about the fine art of, here's one of the blanks, discretion. Discretion. Learning when and where to keep your mouth shut. Have you ever regretted something you said? All of us have, I'm sure. Like the old joke about the preacher encouraging people to stand and testify to the congregation about sins they committed years ago that God has long ago forgiven. And after a few moments of awkward silence, one brave soul in the back stood up and announced the sin of his past that God had forgiven. And so once the ice was broken by that brave soul, more people began to shout out sins for which they had been forgiven, until there was this real period of awkward silence after one gentleman announced his sin. And the preacher said, "Brother, I'm not sure I would have said that out loud." Sometimes we say things we regret. Each of us has probably been in a situation where we wished we hadn't said something out loud. That's another occasion for bite your tongue. Bite your tongue. You know what that feels like, don't you? Saying something out of turn, saying something you wish you wouldn't have said, but you said it, and people heard it. Impressions have been made, and reactions have begun. But it's too late to take it back. There's no putting it back in the bottle. That can happen to the best of us. But in Ecclesiastes 10:14, Solomon says the one who lets that happen often is a fool. He said, fools multiply words. There are some people who just don't have enough good sense to know when to stop talking. So let me ask you, what's worse than saying something you wish you had never said? Well, it's trying to explain why you said it. And you just keep digging that hole. You keep digging that hole deeper and deeper. You know the first law of holes, don't you? The more you dig, the deeper you get. When you find yourself in a hole, what's the best advice? Stop digging. Quit digging. That's when you need to tell yourself, shut up already. Shut my mouth. Bite my tongue. That can certainly be true in our conversations. Sometimes saying less is more. Well, how can you say less? What's the key? Here's the good piece of wisdom. Think before you speak. Think before you speak. Think about what you want to say and how best to say it. Because that'll spare you a whole lot of trouble. And saying less is sometimes better than saying more. And sometimes saying nothing at all is better. And sometimes saying nothing at all is more powerful. Silence can be the best sermon ever preached. Gary will probably attest to this, although I've not talked to him about it. But almost any preacher or any evangelist, any church member who is known for his testimony for Christ, when he walks into or she walks into a situation where the person has been unfaithful to the Lord, what they're expecting from the preacher at least is for the preacher to chastise them or somehow preach a sermon to them. Right? They're uncomfortable. They know the preacher's going to say something to them about their carelessness toward the Lord. You know what the best thing I think a preacher can do sometimes in a situation like that? Not say a word. The reason is they already know the sermon. But me not saying the sermon makes a greater impact upon them than if I opened my mouth and said something. Sometimes saying nothing at all is better than saying anything. I learned this early in my ministry. I remember very distinctly, it was a restaurant on the north side of Highway 54 in Jefferson City. This was back before I think we even had any children. I'll tell you how long ago this was. And I was sitting in this restaurant meeting room with a lot of other preachers. We were planning a big event, statewide event. And I was one of the youngest preachers in the room. But I just was watching. The ones who were doing most of the talking, guess who they were? Young bucks like me. Young guys. And I observed it was the older, more experienced guys, wise men, who just sat quietly and listened and said little. These were men whom I had known for many years, and I highly respected them, and I just took note of the fact that they sat quietly, although they had to know a whole lot more than any of us young guys. But they didn't say much. And when they did talk, everybody listened because their words were few to begin with, and they had something important to say. I took away from that meeting something obviously I have never forgotten. A wise person knows when to be quiet. Now, while that's good advice by itself, Solomon adds an extra element to it. Not only think before you speak, but don't say everything that you are thinking. That's another bit of wisdom. That's the wisdom of discretion, of restraint, of holding your tongue. And a good example or a good occasion for practicing this is when you're talking about someone who is not present. You've been in conversations about people who were not there in hearing range. Here's what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 10:20. Do not speak against the king in your private quarters, or curse the high and mighty in your bedroom. Do not speak against the king in your private quarters, or curse the high and mighty in your bedroom. Well, here I am in my private quarters. Here I am in my own bedroom. I should be able to say whatever I want to say. The one you're talking about can't hear what you're saying. You ought to be able to say whatever you want to say. Feel free about it, but you best not do that. And Solomon tells us why in Ecclesiastes 10:20. Because a bird in the sky may carry your words and report what you say. You've always wondered where we got that expression. A little birdie told me. Got it from Solomon. Even though you're in your own private quarters, in your own bedroom, be careful what you say about a person who's not present, because a bird might carry your words, and the person about whom you were speaking will eventually find it out. You're saying something you think the person will never hear it. Before you know it, somebody tells somebody who tells somebody else, until the person about whom you were talking finds out about it and takes offense. I'm guessing most everyone in the room has experienced that. We call that talking behind someone's back. And we can rationalize it, we can justify it by asserting that we weren't saying anything that was all that bad. But here's a good rule of thumb for us to follow. Wisdom from Solomon. Don't say something about someone else that you wouldn't want repeated to them. Don't say something about someone else that you don't want attributed to you. How embarrassing that is when the person about whom we have been speaking finds out what we said, and we are confronted by that person who was offended by it. And we recognize the wisdom of Solomon. We should have just shut our mouth. Keep that little birdie in mind everywhere you go. Don't say what you don't want repeated. So here's the word of wisdom from Proverbs 11:12. He who speaks against his neighbor lacks good sense, but a man of understanding keeps his mouth silent. One of my ministries several years ago was difficult in the sense that I found myself spending a lot of energy and time putting out the proverbial fires. You know what that means, don't you? I expended a lot of energy putting out fires. And one of those fires was started by a person, it happened to be a woman in our congregation, who said something about someone. I can't even remember now what the context was or who it was about or anything about it, except that she spoke a word to somebody who she confided, but that person then told somebody else who then told me. That's never happened to anybody in this room, right? This is a unique situation. So I had the unfortunate privilege of going to the woman and telling her that on this date, at this time of day, I know you said this to that person, but what we need to remember is the people in whom we confide may become careless and then pass it along to somebody else, even unknowingly, who then gets it back to the person about whom it was said. Now, she hadn't said it about me, as I recall. I wasn't personally offended. My concern was, it was a undercurrent in that congregation that disallowed us from progressing. It was a cancer
in that congregation. And I was the doctor who had to excise it. Cut open the wound and pull out the cancer. You have to stop this. You can't do this. The body is dying because of stuff like this. Be careful what you say when you say it. All right, let's talk about another topic. What if it isn't you talking about someone else, but someone else talking about you? How do you deal with that? You've heard what they said and you are offended. How do you deal with that kind of a situation? Well, here's advice from Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 16. Fools show their annoyance at once, but the wise person will overlook an insult. A wise person will overlook an insult. So when you're offended, what's the knee-jerk reaction? What's the default position? I'm going to react. That wasn't true. That wasn't fair. I'm going to get even. That's our carnal nature coming to the surface. It shows in your face. It shows in your manner. And it may also come out with your words. Solomon says the wise person will overlook the insult and let it go. We have an expression in our language. We should let it go like water off a duck's back. Not very easy, is it, to be insulted and let it go. The idea is we're not going to let something bother us. That's a pretty good idea when we are insulted. In many cases, the insult was unintentional. The person didn't intend harm. Sometimes it's just stupid or silly, and we shouldn't waste time on silly insults. Sometimes the insults are so obviously unfair that it doesn't warrant a response from us. Everybody who knows us knows better. Sometimes it is intentional. Sometimes people do attack us, say things unfair about us, make accusations or insult us. But the good advice from Solomon is just let it go, like water off a duck's back. Think about something else in our speech. Let's talk about humor. Inappropriate humor. There are times when we say things intending to be funny. We take little cuts, swipes, and digs in the name of fun or humor, but the humor is not appreciated by everybody. You can see it by their expression, you can see it in their body language, you can see they're not laughing. Pretty good indicator they didn't think it was all that funny. In fact, there are times that our attempt at humor is inappropriate. And here's what Solomon says in Proverbs 26, 18 and 19. Like a madman shooting flaming arrows is the one who deceives his neighbor and says, "Oh, I was only joking." We take a dig, we take a swipe at somebody, and then we get the reaction we weren't expecting, that they weren't humored by it at all. In fact, they were offended. I was just joking. We should have known before we spoke or acted that what we said or did was dangerous. And just saying, well, I was just kidding, doesn't really undo the damage. You've been on the other end of that. And we need to practice the golden rule. Do unto others as you have them do unto you. Now, I enjoy and appreciate a good sense of humor as much as anybody. It spices up the personality. It makes it more fun to be around each other. But humor can be a tricky thing to do. To do right. And that's especially true regarding sarcasm. Sarcasm is a unique kind of humor, but it's a very dangerous kind of humor. I have a preacher friend who is a master at sarcasm. I almost hate to say it, I admire him. Everybody knows he is Mr. Sarcasm. But, boy, you've got to be very careful with sarcastic comments. And there have been many times I've caught myself on the verge of saying something sarcastic and saying, whoa, bite your tongue. Hold your tongue. Shut your mouth, because it's very dangerous. Sometimes we learn this the hard way when we cross the line. So here's a word to the wise. Beware of humor that offends someone who is listening. Be sensitive to the clues in the setting. Also, beware of humor that makes you look bad. I'm not talking about bad jokes, the dad jokes that make you look bad. I'm talking about jokes that make you look bad. Oh, you might get a good laugh, but you realize after the fact that you may not have presented yourself very well with that humorous remark. But you've already said it, it's out there. People are forming opinions about you and that clever little humorous thing you just said. Beware. People may have a bad impression of you. I have another friend, not a preacher, who is an expert at this. Inappropriate humor. Hank is his name. Hank would say anything to get a laugh. He would tell you that. He had an expression for himself that I will not repeat in this context, but that was his life, was to get a laugh. His humor could be inappropriate and coarse, even crude. But so long as he got the laugh, that's what he was after. And it's the reason some people consider him to be a boor, an unrefined, ill-mannered person. It wasn't that what he said wasn't funny, it was that it was inappropriate. It was at somebody else's expense. Oh, I saw the humor in what he said, but I did not appreciate the manner in which he presented it, or the context in which he spoke the words. It made him look bad. And when the Christian looks bad, the non-Christians who are witnessing it draw conclusions about our master. If we make ourselves look bad because of our inappropriate humor, it reflects poorly upon our God. We need to be very careful. And don't assume that what you say in the circle of close friends is going to stay in that circle and go nowhere else. Remember the little birdie. There is a little birdie in every gathering of your closest friends. I'm not trying to suggest that your closest friends would betray your confidence, but what I am saying is that when they are with another set of close friends, and in the right moment of carelessness or thoughtlessness, they blurt out something clever that you said in the other circle of close friends, and it's out. And they have inadvertently become the little birdie. And now in that other person's circle of close friends, you look bad. Because in that unguarded moment, they carelessly repeat what you said. We confide in somebody, a little joke or whatever, and we say, don't tell anybody else, and you say, my lips are sealed. Well, lips come unsealed pretty easily in the right context. So don't fall into the trap of saying every funny thing that comes to your mind. remember, cheap humor costs more than you want to pay. A couple of things real quickly. We acknowledge the wisdom that we should not speak ill of the dead. But we would do well to include the living. We have to be careful with what we say around and about those who are less fortunate. Those who are less fortunate. Solomon says in Proverbs 17:5, "He who mocks the poor shows disrespect for his maker." It is definitely inappropriate to speak ill about those of diminished physical or mental capability. We learned those manners as children, I'm sure. Our parents taught us that. Speaking ill about the physically or mentally impaired, making fun of them, making light of them, making them the brunt of our jokes. But here's something else that we maybe didn't learn quite as well. We must also be careful with critical perceptions about how those people got into their situations. I'll give you an example. The alcoholic or drunkard. The obese. I don't suppose there's any way we can avoid seeing some of those things about people and immediately making some judgments about how they got to where they are. I mean, we can work on avoiding that, but what's much easier to do is don't speak it. Don't speak it. Don't mock the poor because that disrespects their maker. Now, however true and accurate our perception is about how that person got into the situation that we see they are in, however true that may be, we need to employ restraint and great caution in verbalizing it. Thinking it is one thing, saying it aloud is another. And that's another reason to be very discreet. We're back to discretion. That same proverb goes on to say, "He who rejoices at another's calamity will not go unpunished." Sometimes the person is suffering hard times, maybe because they're getting exactly what they deserved. The old phrase, "You made your bed, now you're sleeping in it." Well, however true that may be, it does no good for that person for you to verbalize it. Display some discretion. Even when they deserve it, it's good advice not to celebrate their calamity. We call that gloating. Gloating. Gloating looks bad on anyone, but when Christians do it, it looks especially bad because it's contrary to the nature of God. And I would encourage you to apply this principle about gloating to the political, the racial, and religious contexts as well. People who get what they have coming to them, as our proverb says. People who've made that bed and now they're sleeping in it. It's no reason for us to gloat in their misfortune. So here's the bottom line. Learning to hold your tongue is a major step toward becoming wise. Proverbs 17:28 says, "Even fools appear to be wise when they keep silent and hold their tongue." Think before you speak. And don't say everything you're thinking. That's it in a nutshell. Think before you speak. And then don't speak everything you're thinking. The wise man or woman practices discretion in their speech, which many times means holding their tongue. And I've never seen Forrest Gump, but that's all I got to say about that. That's all I got. All right, for just a couple moments, let's review. A fundamental element in the process of learning wisdom is to know when to shut my mouth. What does Ecclesiastes 10:14 say of those who multiply, the one who multiplies words? He's a fool. To think before you speak and refraining from saying everything you think is an aspect of wisdom known as discretion. One person about whom you should not talk is the person who is not present. Advice from the little birdie. Don't say anything about someone else that you don't want getting back to them, don't want repeated and being attributed to you. How can you display wisdom when someone says something that offends you? Overlook it. Overlook it. Be mature about it. One particular area, oh, by the way, I have to throw this in here. I have not mastered all of this. I'm working on this just like everybody else, okay? One particular area of speech that can be offensive and warrants great care is humor, and in particular, sarcasm. Beware of humor that makes you look bad. Don't say every funny thing that comes to your mind. What is one way a fool may appear to be wise? Holding his tongue. Even a fool looks wise when he holds his tongue. I wrote down the quote here from Abraham Lincoln. Remember what it was? Better to remain silent and thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Wisdom from Abraham Lincoln. Not inspired, but certainly based upon inspired scripture. All right, here's the good rule of thumb with regard to our speech. Think before you speak, and don't say everything you are thinking. Man, you guys are good listeners. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.